Today's Focus report takes us to Scotland, where a second independence referendum could be on the horizon. That in response to the UK voting to leave the European Union. The country's First Minister earlier this week said she remains determined to push ahead with the vote over the next couple of years, coinciding with the expected conclusion of the UK's Brexit negotiations. But a Scottish breakaway from Britain would need the green light from Prime Minister Theresa May. Contrary to the results of the first referendum in 2014, Scots are now more likely to vote in favour of independence, with many people fearing the impact Brexit will have on Scottish industries.
The Scottish Highlands, coastal towns like Ullapool, were built around one of Scotland's traditional resources, fishing. Last June, many fishermen who felt penalised by EU quotas voted to leave the European Union. James Stephen was one of them, but he fears that Brexit may not, in fact, turn out to be a good deal for the fishing industry.
In return for Britain to get a good Brexit deal, I could see the fishing rights maybe even being worse than they are at the moment.
A large part of Scotland's fish production is sold in Europe by exporters like Peter McCann. Along with 62% of fellow Scots, Peter voted to remain in the EU. On account of Brexit, he wants an independent Scotland.
The fishing industry in Scotland is best protected by Scotland, and with the context of Brexit, it definitely needs to be looked after by Scottish people, not those in London. You know, fishing isn't a priority for London or Westminster. Yeah, I welcome the fact there'll be a new referendum on independence.
Inverness, capital of the Highlands. Here, questions of identity are taken seriously. Scotland's nationalist First Minister wants a new referendum on independence to be held within 2 years. In pubs like Peter McCann's local, Scotland's political future is again the main topic of conversation.
I feel that with the information that we have now, in view of the last referendum, I will certainly vote yes.
The UK is left stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're going to find it difficult going into the EU to negotiate their Brexit deal when the potential is that the UK will no longer exist as it does today.
Another traditional Scottish industry, whisky. The Glasgow distillery was created by Ian McDougall 3 years ago. Europe is the main export market for Ian, who believes that independence does make business sense.
The referendum on independence is inevitable. We really have no option here. We have to continue trade with Europe, and the only way we can do that is by being part of Europe and coming out of the UK.
Brexit has created a fundamental fault line that Scottish nationalists will exploit until they get what they want.
We set out in our manifesto that we would have the right to go back to the Scottish people and have a mandate if circumstances materially changed. Exit from the EU is a material change in circumstance, and I think it's quite right that Scottish people have their say of what kind of future they want.
According to opinion polls, Scotland is evenly divided on independence. When any new campaign starts, the Conservative and Labour parties will be on the no side, against independence.
The key thing is here, there is no guarantee, none at all, that an independent Scotland could actually become a member of the European Union. The European Commission has said this week that Scotland will have to make a fresh application as an accession state, and we know then that they will have to comply with the convergence criteria.
With a large deficit in public spending, Scotland would probably not meet the economic criteria required to rejoin the EU. But some sectors of the economy are growing fast. Edinburgh has become an alternative to the City of London for financial services. Joe DiRollo and his team have assessed risks for banks for 25 years. He believes that a new referendum would bring more uncertainty.
We obviously have very important relationships with England. Most of our customers are English. Will there be trade barriers with England? Will there be a different currency? Will it introduce currency risk for us? So all sorts of uncertainty.
A funds manager, David Sinclair, is also convinced that Scotland is stronger in the Union.
It was divisive last time. I think it could be worse this time around, especially if it's more emotional rather than based on economic arguments. I think the timing of the Brexit negotiations and the timing of the referendum will be crucial. If the referendum happens before the UK leaves the European Union, then it'd be quite difficult perhaps to make a rational decision if we don't know what Brexit will look like.
The British Prime Minister, Theresa May, is unlikely to bow down publicly to the pressure of Scottish nationalists and let them decide when the referendum will be held.
Right, let's take a closer look at this story by crossing to Keith Dixon, a professor of British civilization at Lyon 2 University. Professor Dixon, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 today. Now, the Scottish government calling for a second independence referendum. Has it thrown a spanner in the works? What does this mean now for Britain's Conservative government?
Well, I think that what's happening here is that Nicola Sturgeon is introducing a greater dose of uncertainty into what is already a fairly uncertain situation for the British government. We don't know exactly what are going to be the contours of the Brexit deal. We don't know whether Theresa May is going to be listened to or not by her European partners. And the fact that the Scots are now, or at least the Scottish government is now considering a second referendum is obviously going to be a hindrance, an obstacle, much more than, I think, an irritation for Theresa May during the next 2 years.
Well, as you say, it would be a Scottish referendum would be counterproductive for May. It would perhaps weaken her position when it comes to sort of negotiating this divorce from the EU.
Well, obviously, she's going to be now entering these discussions, leading what is self-evidently now as a divided state, a divided British state. And this certainly cannot help her in what are going to be extremely difficult negotiations for her within Europe.
But Theresa May still has the upper hand. After all, she needs to give the green light for any sort of independence referendum to go ahead at the end of the day.
Yeah, of course, she does have the upper hand, but at the same time, she walks a very, very narrow path. If she uses that upper hand, as you say, too brutally, what might well happen is that part of Scottish political opinion, the undecided voters of the last referendum, may well turn against her if they feel that she's leaning too heavily on the democratically elected government of Scotland.
Meanwhile, what are Nicola Sturgeon's weaknesses when it comes to the issue of independence?
Well, I think her major difficulty is that it was already said during the 2014 referendum that this would be a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Scottish independence. Now, we're in a fairly short generation here with another referendum coming up. If the nationalists were to lose the referendum in 2 years' time, if the referendum does take place in 2 years' time, if they were to lose, then this would put Scottish independence off the agenda for a long, long period of time, I think. So it's make or break for Nicola Sturgeon, just as it is in many ways make or break for Theresa May.
Well, if it does go to another vote, Professor Dixon, do you believe that we will see the Scots break away from the UK? I mean, we have seen reports of an upsurge in support for independence, for Scottish independence.
Yeah. As you know, I have no crystal ball, and it's going to be a very, very difficult call, I think, the next referendum. There has been an upsurge, historically speaking. There's been an upsurge of support for Scottish independence. Over the last 5 years, support has doubled in the opinion polls. But the two camps, for and against Scottish independence, are still very much neck and neck. So it will very much depend on how the supporters of independence handle their campaign over the next 2 years. And as I just suggested, it will also very much depend on how the British Prime Minister reacts to Scottish demands for a new referendum. So both Nicola Sturgeon and Theresa May, I believe, are walking a very narrow path. It's going to be a very difficult period for these two formidable politicians.
OK, Professor Dixon, thank you so much for your time and for your insight today. That was Professor Keith Dixon from Lyon 2 University.